Shalom and welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney Smith, here today with a very special guest. Please welcome Dr. Ryan Mullins. How are you?
Doing all right today.
Wonderful. Hopefully we won't have any interruptions. As you know, there's probably like this big storm sweeping in. It just kind of came through Florida, Georgia, and I'm in Alabama, so we are right next door. And there's some glitches. Hopefully that won't be a problem though. So please tell us a little bit about yourself for my audience. We may not know much about you. I am very familiar with you. I reached out to you. I look back, it's been a year. I'm sorry. It's been
Was
a
it that
year
long
ago.
ago?
Yes.
Oh gosh, all right.
Yeah, I was like, ugh, I'm really doing bad. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, that's all right. So for those who don't know, I'm Ryan Mullins. I have a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews, and a doctoral habilitation in dogmatics from the University of Helsinki. So I primarily work in philosophical theology. I've written 4 books now, soon to be 5. It's coming out. Another one's coming out next month. The first one was on God and time. The second one was called God and Emotion. Third one was a Spanish version of that book that was longer, called God, Scripture, and Emotion. And then the fourth one is this brand new book called Eternal in Love. So it's a little book about a big God. So it's an introduction to philosophical theology and systematic theology. Just what exactly is God like? Why would God create anything at all? And then it's got a lot more like spiritual insights, devotion, and a way more sarcasm than most publishers will ever let me get away with. So I'm pretty pleased with this one. Like it's quite good. Last few
I'm
things about me.
very
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
haven't gotten it. I'm very eager to get it. I've been watching your promos and I'm like, I gotta add that one to the list. So sorry, go ahead.
So I had, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but yeah. So yeah, the final thing I want to say is like, yeah, so I'm a lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Lucerne. So it's an online master's program in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy. And then I also teach philosophy at the master's program at the University of Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. So I'm around a lot of different places in the world.
Yes, and that was actually originally how I reached out to you. I'm very much into Judaism and Christianity, and of course, you have to dabble a little bit in Islam. But
Mhm.
yeah, that was what I wanted. But then the more I kind of dove into this with your work, I was like, he's okay. You won't say this, but I'll say this. He's such a big brain, and I was like, I am just not equipped to. So I waited and I read more, and then my kid got sick, and I was like, oh, and I had to push the interview off, and you were so humble about, yeah, take care of your family, come back to it when you can. So we're going to kind of go through a lot of different things. Listen, you have so many deep theological, philosophical, like conversations that are relevant for those of us in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So go ahead and say what you were going to say about your book, because you said we'll get into that in a second, and then we'll transition.
Yeah, so the book, so I write all these big academic books, and they cost like $100 or more. It's really annoying. No one can afford that stuff, so you have to pirate it from like a Russian website. And whereas this one, like the goal was, I want something that people can actually afford to buy, and it's actually readable. And so it's only like $25, and I actually make money from this one, whereas I don't make money from the other big academic books. Even though they're $100, I get like $1. So I don't care if you pirate it from a Russian website. With this one, it mattered to me a lot that people could understand it. So I had a lot of people who do not have a professional background in philosophy or theology read it to make sure it made sense. And so I got a lot of feedback from like scholars, but like
Yeah.
also people who are interested, like a lot of YouTubers also read it as well, just to make sure this is actually readable and understandable.
Yeah, so that it's kind of for a popular audience, which would be me. I am more on the exegetical theological side than I am philosophy, but as we all know, philosophy cannot be avoided. So we're going to go ahead and get into this. Now, I want you to answer this in any way that you feel like is relevant for your personal belief, as well as specifically to a Bible believing Christian or messianic like myself. Ready? What is God?
Mhm. So
I
the
know that sounds
concept
crazy,
of God,
right? Okay.
Yeah, but no, like well, I was so like when I first started writing this Eternal in Love book, I was talking about it at a conference in Germany, in Berlin, and there was a student there in theology. He's doing in the middle of his PhD, and this is the question. He's like, "We don't talk about that in Germany." I'm so interested that you're actually doing that question, and all the Germans thought it was super weird that I was like, "Yeah, this is an important question," because they're like, "We just don't talk about that. It's too personal," and I'm like, "Is it?" I mean, so anyway, yeah, I think it's important. So the concept of God is a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so I think that's like the basic core concept. What I do in a lot of my work is I look at different models of God. So a model of God is going to be a unique articulation of that idea. So what exactly does it mean to be perfect? A model of God's going to go, here's some attributes that explain that. What does it mean that God's the single ultimate foundation of reality? A model of God's going to go, here's different theories of emanation or different kinds of theories of creation, and they'll spell that out. And so that's where a lot of my work is on those kind of questions.
Yeah, no, I love it because again, there's just some of the very simple basics people I don't think cover enough. So it's
Mhm.
interesting that they kind of said, yeah, we just don't even talk about this.
Yeah.
So now I was listening to your live the other day, and you, if memory serves me, you said you hate kind of this next topic. And I was like, oh no, because that's one of my interview questions. But the next question is God infinite?
Yeah. So I was being extra snarky for entertainment value
Oh,
on
okay,
TikTok
good.
Live the other
Okay.
day. Yeah. So like I have a complicated history with this. So one of the first papers I published, I talk about how God's infinite, and then like a few years later, some group in Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, asked me to present the paper, and so I was reading through it, and I get to the infinity part, and I was like, I don't think I believe this anymore. And I don't think I
Ah,
even know what it means anymore. And so here's the problem. So infinity has a very complicated history in Western thought, and and when you're looking at like the ancient like the ancient world and late antiquity, so like that kind of like time period, no one wants to say that God's infinite. It's not a popular thing. You'll find a couple people here or there who will say that, but it's just not a popular statement to make because infinity had these notions of incomplete, maybe chaotic, completely unknowable, and so people are like, well, God's not chaotic, God's not incomplete. Um, Maybe we can't know everything about God, but God at least knows Himself. So
yeah,
God cannot be infinite. And then when you get to the late Middle Ages, popularity completely flips, and it starts to
yeah,
become a very popular attribute. And then now today, it's just like, who would deny it?
right.
Me, I will deny it. Here's why: I don't know what it means.
Yeah,
So here's a couple different things. So sometimes when we say God's infinite, what we mean is God's perfect. And I'm like, okay, well, I can spell out God's perfection without using the word infinity.
right.
Um, Sometimes people will say infinite means God's unlimited. And I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about that for a second. What does that mean? And they'll start spelling it out, and they're just going back to being perfect again.
Omniscience and
Uh,
stuff.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's all powerful. He's all knowing. And you're like, okay, well, can he like create a square circle? They're like, well, no. There's like some logical limits. I'm like, okay, so he is limited in some sense. Um, and then Spinoza has this view where God's going to be completely unlimited. So if anything other than God exists, well, that would be a limit on God. And so you and I have to be like, in some sense, like identified with God. Like
More like
God's like a rug, and like you're a bump in the rug is kind of what Spinoza's view is.
ah, interesting. I don't know that I've ever heard that expression. Kind of, I guess, could make sense. Is that kind of more like a pantheistic or panentheistic view?
It
It
is,
is.
yeah. So Spinoza is usually associated with pantheism,
I figured.
and there, I don't know enough about the history of this. There are some earlier Jewish thinkers who had this view. There's this medieval debate called all Godism, which is basically what we would just say called today pantheism, because the idea would be like, well, what exists? You're like, well, God. You're like, does anything else exist? I not really. I mean, you're either like God's imaginary friend, you're just like an
Yeah.
idea in the mind of God, or you're just God's the rug and you're a bump in the rug. So
Yeah.
that's some of these medieval Jewish debates on this.
Interesting. God having imaginary friends. I'll say I've never contemplated that. Now I have, though, and I will continue. Next
Yes. So my
question.
friend Sam Liebens has
Oh,
a. Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no.
I was going to
Carry
say
on.
there's a paper. Yeah. So my friend Sam Liebens, he's a rabbi and he teaches Jewish philosophy, and so he has this really fun paper that he wrote when we were working together at Notre Dame, and it's just called God and His Imaginary Friends. And so this is something we've debated a bit because he wants to develop this view where there's just God and then the universe and everything else are just ideas in the mind of God. So you and I are just literally ideas. And I want to go, no, I'm more
Interesting.
than an idea. Like,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Like ones and zeros is that equivalent, you think, or no?
yeah, I mean, that's all you'd be. Yeah,
Yeah,
you would just be ones and zeros in the mind of God. That's it.
it kind of makes me feel sad. Like you said, I'm a
That's
little
what
more
I would think. I want to be more
so
than that. But Sam's like, what else is there? So yeah.
yeah. Okay. So is God bound by time? Is he in it? Is he out of it? Can he be in both at the same time in the same sense? Go off.
Yeah. So God is not bound by time because I want to say that time is an essential attribute of God. So in the same way that God's not bound by his power or his love, because I don't know what that means. Time is an essential attribute of God, so it's not something he's bound by. But I should explain what that means because that just sounds weird to just say that. So everyone wants to say God is eternal. So God exists without beginning and without end. That's not too controversial. Things get controversial when you make extra claims about God being timeless or temporal. And so if you say God's timeless, you have to say God exists without beginning, without end, because he's eternal. But it's also the case that God does not have temporal location, so he doesn't exist right now, and he doesn't have succession, so he doesn't do one thing and then another. Whereas
Hmm.
if you think God's temporal, you're going to say, well, he does exist right now. Like,
Yeah,
come on, like that seems really like banal to say that like,
yeah.
God exists right now, but if God's timeless, then he can't. Um, and you'd also say God does one thing and then another. And
Okay.
so I want to affirm that view that God's temporal. The claim that God is time, that's a stronger claim that
Right.
you see in like Isaac Newton, for example. So the idea is time is this substance, or you can attribute it to a substance that
Hmm.
plays several different roles. So it's this natured entity that makes change possible. So why is change in the world possible? Time. Uh, like why are these different moments of time? Why do they exist? And you're like, well,
Hmm.
time is the source of moments. A moment is the way things are, but could be like different later.
Different.
What explains the existence of those things? Time. And then
Yeah.
I got a timeline, like a series of moments that are in some sort of coherent timeline.
Yeah. Like
What makes that possible? And you say time. And
gotcha.
so
Yeah.
if God plays those roles, then God is time.
Yeah. So in light of like the biblical narrative, would you place God like at creation? Let's just say at the very first word, Bereshit. Where do you place him? If we could, if we
Mhm.
can I use that word place?
Yeah, sure. It's a temporal location. So I think the earliest time mentioned in scripture is of the reality prior to creation.
I
So
agree.
Gershom Bryn, so Gershom Bryn's this scholar of like the Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so he's
Uh-huh.
got this nice little book on time in the Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's right there in the name of the book. So it's
Yeah.
but he points to like Psalm 90 to say like it talks about God being everlasting, everlasting prior to creation.
Mhm.
And so I think that's right. I think you've got, if you affirm something like the doctrine of creation out of nothing, the claim is God was once all alone, God and
Mhm.
nothing else. And then there's God and some stuff that he created. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds right to me. And if you believe God's temporal, you take that very literally. Yeah, God all alone, and then God with stuff.
So, pick your brain right fast. Is it
Mhm.
possible that the world could have pre-existed in some have been some sort of eternal thing? Because in light of what you just said, I wouldn't think no. But is it possible in the Genesis narrative, right? We have the critical scholars saying no, there was substance, it was already there. God just shaped it and formed it, and that chaos narrative, Um, and yet we do know that there were ancients. We can see this in like in the Talmud Megillah. locations where we have people that believe that there was something before this something that we see in Genesis. And what that was, no one can speculate, I guess, or you could speculate, no one knows. Um, what could that be? Like, how is that more of like a attribute? Is it a substance? How? Because like you have matter and all of that. Where are you putting all of these things? Does that make any sense? What I'm saying?
It does. Yeah, no, because there's a bunch of views on this. So let's talk about Gersonides for a second, since you have more interest in Jewish philosophy. So Gersonides, he wants to reject creation out of nothing. He thinks it's false,
Yeah, ex nihilo is
but he
gone.
does not want to. Yeah, so he's like, get rid of that. I don't like that. But he also wants to say eternal creation. That's also false. So God and the universe being co-eternal, he's like, that's not quite right. So what he affirms is there's this thing called prime matter that existed before the universe, and so God kind of creates out of this prime matter. Now here's where it gets weird, and where I just want to go. I can't follow you anymore, Gersonides. This is nuts. So there's this prime matter, this physical stuff that has no properties at all. So it doesn't even have like mass or quantity or anything like that. It has no spatial location whatsoever. And I'm like, it's physical, but it has zero properties, no qualities, no spatial location. That sounds like you're describing nothing. And he's like, no, trust me. It's, and I'm like, it sounds like nothing to me.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Can you recommend something so I could read there?
Yeah. So Gersonides has this book called The Wars of the Lord.
Okay.
And it's, I think the translation I had read was like 3 volumes, and so I think it's the third volume that you want, and all the chapter headings are very clear. So it's just like different views on creation, arguments for and against them, why I think these are wrong, why I think these are right. Like it just goes through it just that systematically.
Yeah. Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of takes us a little bit into the next question. So divine simplicity. Is God love? Is he spirit? Is he some of these things? Of course, we see it's described as God is love in the book of 1 John. God is spirit, i.e. God has this Holy Spirit. What is this Holy Spirit? Is that God? So there's a lot of like metaphysical claims that could be made. Divine simplicity. Should we take it? Should we toss it? What do we do with it?
I think we should toss it. It's been a controversial doctrine throughout Western history and Eastern religions too. It's like Ramanuja, the Hindu tradition, was like, this violates scripture and it's incoherent. Get rid of it. And then you see people like Al-Ghazali in the Islamic tradition doing the exact same thing. So here's the doctrine. So the claim is there's God, and God has no attributes at all. So in the Islamic tradition, there's what's called the attributionist view, which says simplicity is false because God does have attributes. He actually does have distinct attributes. Simplicity says no attributes at all, no properties at all, no metaphysical distinction of any sort that you can think of. So you might be thinking, well, what about that distinction in my head between like God's power and his wisdom? Get rid of that. That's not there. Well, what about like love is not the same thing as existence? Like get rid of that. They're all the same when you're talking about God. If you think God's simple, it's wild.
Yeah.
And that in of itself, usually a lot of times when contemporary philosophers, when they just hear what the doctrine actually says, that's enough for them to go, I'm out. Like I'm done with this.
Yeah. I think,
but for some reason it's made a big comeback in certain circles. And yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry. There's a little bit of delay. I don't know if that's my end or your end, but yeah, I'm seeing it come back in the Islamic circles. Is that where you're kind of seeing it come back?
Well, it's weird in the Islamic circles because the majority view throughout Islamic history and today has been to say simplicity is false. The minority position that you see in like Avicenna, for example, who's a brilliant philosopher, that's been the minority position. And so what I'm seeing today is a lot of Thomists in the Christian tradition have made this like huge push of like simplicity or atheism. And I'm seeing some like Islamic apologists kind of going, not all, because a bunch of them are going, this is awful, horrible, get rid of it. But some of them are going, let's mimic that same kind of language of simplicity or atheism.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad that you said that, because it does seem to be in like the internet Islamic atheist crowd. I don't know. Listen, I have to be honest. I've not studied the philosophy from really big brains in the Islamic philosophy world, so I wouldn't be able to account for that. But just the world that I'm in, it's making a comeback, and it's weird to me, I guess.
It is, and I've talked to. So I've been on this this very very popular Islamic YouTube channel called Blogging Theology. They've had me on a few
Mm,
times to talk about simplicity and the nature of God, and yeah, they're confused by it too, because they're just like, this has just not been the majority position. And some of the different Islamic philosophers that I'm friends with, that I chat with, they're like, we don't understand why this is making such a huge splash in different circles, because it's just been something we reject for a very long
yeah,
time.
yeah, I agree. Now, and do you think that it has anything to do with like the concept of the Trinity, trying to be very like super monotheistic? Do you think so?
I think that would make sense in a lot of the online apologetics, like Islamic apologetics circles, because that's one of the easiest arguments to run against the Trinity, because all you have to do is say this: simplicity demands strict numerical identity through and through. Anything you want to say that's intrinsic of God, you have to say is identical to God. So
Yeah.
the Father is intrinsic to God, well, therefore is identical to God. The Son is intrinsic to God, therefore identical to God. Identity is transitive, so Father and Son are identical to each other. Ooh, okay, no Trinity, and you're done. Like, it's that simple to say the Trinity's false.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like their biggest academic, like strong hand, like JavaScript. That's the first thing they want to
Mhm.
go with. And then they're going to say, look, I've got divine simplicity to help, ring this in for me. I agree. I think we should just, it needs to be better presented for me to understand what someone means by this and the implications of it down the road for me to even get on board with it. So I'm glad that you agree. Okay, so now here's the next one. In light of these conversations that we tend to have, because I know you deal a little bit with some ethics, right? You kind of dabble in like
Some.
moral ethics of
Mhm.
the philosophy. So should Christians appeal to divine command theory in light of God being the uncaused cause? And the reason why I say this is because whenever we do apologetic work, especially for like atheists or whatever, we're going to get the constant like problem of evil, and we're going to get some of these things like, how do we justify where our morals come from? And when I look around me, I see nature, I don't see your God. And so it's going to come back to, at least for the Christian, it's going to all hinge back in like a Calvinistic way. I hate to bring Calvin into this, but like in a Calvinistic way, it's really all God's fault in
Mhm.
like divine providence. And so divine command theory, is it a good thing? Is it a good excuse? I mean, because if not, if not, how do we go about our morals? And yet none of it is subjective.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different views you can take on the relationship between God and morality. One view you could affirm is just there's like some sort of Platonic realm of just these necessary truths, truths of logic, truths of mathematics, truths of morality. And you say God and this Platonic realm just both necessarily exist. Cool. And but the Platonic realm, like the moral facts there are really thin. And you can even do this too if you just take the Platonic realm and put it in the mind of God and say it's just God and his divine ideas. And so moral facts, logical facts, those are just ideas that God necessarily has. Uh, those basic fundamental moral facts are very thin. They don't really tell you a lot. So John Duns Scotus will say it's so thin it wouldn't even give you the full 10 commandments, because it's
Mm,
going to be something like don't cause unnecessary harm. And you're like,
yeah,
well, cool, but what exactly is harm? And you're like, well, we got to look at the nature of this thing over here and what would bring about harm. And then you have to look at all these other facts of like what would be necessary, not. So you have to look at like lots of non-moral facts and moral facts and smash them together to figure out what you're supposed to do. And so like Scotus's views on like how thin the basic moral facts are, they're not meant to tell you what to do. You have
yeah,
to know all this other stuff.
yeah, yeah.
So here's where divine command theory comes in. So when you're looking at the whole moral landscape, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not just like there's some good stuff, there's bad stuff, there's virtues, there's vices, there's these basic moral facts. that's fine. Divine command theory, what command theory is mainly interested in is where do our obligations come from? Because sometimes we have obligations. Sometimes it's like there's good things to do, but you're not obligated to do them. And then other times you have an obligation. So I saw an old woman crossing the street earlier. Somebody else was already helping her out. I could help her out if I wanted to.
Right.
But, but it'd be good.
Then you'd be virtue signaling.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, like I can do these things is good, but whatever. I don't have an obligation to do it.
Yeah.
But sometimes you do have obligations. You make promises to your family. So like, earlier, like when we were originally trying to set this up, your kid was sick and you're like, you got to take care of your kid. Like that trumps like, this interview. So where does that stuff come from? And so the divine command theorist says, we've got a special story to tell. These obligations, the source of obligations are the commands that God issues to humanity or any sentient beings out there. And so it's really kind of a narrow story. And I think a lot of times in discussions on God and morality in the academic literature and in the popular level, we forget how incredibly narrow the divine command theory is. And so sometimes I want to go get rid of divine command theory. I don't think we need it. And then other times I'm like, oh wait, it's pretty narrow. It's actually like super narrow. So maybe it's not that big of a deal. So I think it depends how narrow you think it is.
So at what point does something become subjective? So I'll tell you, when I do my apologetic work, typically with atheists, this doesn't necessarily happen with Jews per se, but when I argue with atheists, it tends to be that I'll argue from two different points of view. So I have God to us, and then I have us to us. So human to human interaction and God to human. And so I think we adjudicate that the Bible definitely has a difference of adjudication between how God deals with humanity and how God wants humanity to deal with humanity. So for me, that kind of gives some reason for me to think that there's some things that I, as a human, cannot know. Like at the end of my knowledge rope and all that I can do, I have to thus just appeal to a higher sentient being.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, when it comes down to that, I think I would keep divine command theory. Now, I'm not going to use it, well, because God said so. I'm going to do my best to explain something in a logical way so that the non-believer can try and really wrap their head around why it is the Bible says certain things. The Amalekites, that's going to get brought up quite frequently. Why would God allow this? If God is the same today, how come he doesn't allow these things now? How come he doesn't command these things now? So divine command theory comes up quite a lot in these conversations, not so much between interfaith, definitely non-believer to believer.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're right. So one of the things to keep in the back of your head is if you're assuming God's perfectly rational, then there has to be a reason why he issued a command and said, like, this is what you ought to do. So I think you're right to have that intuition of saying, well, I'm not going to tell the atheist because God said so. You're going to try to figure out like the reasons why. And what you're doing there is you're kind of trying to like trace back the steps of like, what would God be thinking? Same thing like when you're doing like science, like there's sometimes that statement of like we're trying to find like the language which God wrote the universe. You're trying to think God's thoughts after him. I think the same thing with these cases of morality and moral reasoning. You're trying to figure out why would God command this, and you're trying to think God's thoughts after him and figure out the reasons why God would do these things or say these things. So I think that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I'm just making sure I'm on track here, because when I look at it, I go, you know what? I serve a God that could theoretically call fire down from heaven. Like, he could smoke you. He could cause a flood. He could have the earth open up and swallow. Why does he specifically command this to humans with regards to the Amalekites and specific things? I think that's important. And I think that that's relevant for the theological. And we can figure out whether or not it's moral or not, ethical, etc. That's fine. But I think when the atheists ask this question, they don't take in all of that background that may or may not be there for them that could persuade them and cause their intuitions to fall into alignment with what we see the Bible saying. So.
I think that's right. Because, I mean, No, I'm still here. So there's something that I think goes when I look at some of these conversations and I see people just like mention some of these verses and they're just like evil, therefore no morality, and I'm like, so you think it's bad, therefore no more. Now that's dumb. Okay. And then the other thing that I keep thinking in my head is all of us definitely think there are certain cases of just wars. Like we
Yes.
really do. And that doesn't mean that like all the wars going on right now are just. I'm just saying
Right.
we all have in our minds certain things where we think that was a just war, that one wasn't. And if you're looking at the Old Testament, some of these passages, if you're willing to say that there are some cases of just wars, I don't understand why you wouldn't go, well, surely these people in the Old Testament thought it was just. Uh,
Mhm.
Maybe let's think a little bit harder before we just go, evil, throw it away. I mean, that doesn't mean that you still couldn't say this is evil and let's get rid of it. But just a little bit of charity is all I'm asking for.
Yeah, charity. I think that's something that sometimes, especially in the internet, doesn't necessarily happen. And the way that I get people to be charitable is I bring it back home a little bit. And I say, for example, with regards to Israel and Palestine. Now, me personally, I feel very sorry for the innocents on both sides. I'll tell you, I would not want to be in the situation that they're in.
Hmm.
I understand the passion on both sides, and that's just my humility. Like I don't want to lose my humanity trying to pick a side on wars and things like that, especially ones that are not happening in my home.
Sure.
Now, what I do though is I tend to say, let me ask you a question. If let's say if you're an American and all of a sudden a Native American knocks on your door and you open the door and they go, "Hi, I don't know, maybe 4 generations ago, this was my land. This right here is my land. I need you to pack up and get out." And when I present it to them that way, I then say, "What would you do? Your house is built, your family is in that house. You are now here. You established your domain here. You didn't take the land, but you're here. What would you do?" Most of them, there's crickets. After that, there is, "Well, I think I'd fight, or maybe I'd bring them in the house with me." Or I said, "Well, what if they don't want to come live with you? Maybe there's like this separation. There has to be a distinct separation." And the reason why I do that is I don't expect to get an answer. I expect to get more humility out of a person, to
You
have
would
that
hope.
humility.
Yeah. No, I think
So,
that's a good move. Yeah.
and then the other one tends to be in light of like morals and God commanding a person to do something that they don't know that they would do or not. And I say, when we're weighing what is beneficial, because we all don't know what is beneficial, when we're weighing what is beneficial, how do we do that? What is it beneficial for a person that commits a crime because he's impulsive and he continues to commit these impulsive crimes? Well, it's good for him. Something's happening in his brain that is like the impulsivity is being soothed. So maybe it's a good thing for that person, but it's obviously not a good thing for the victim. So then, how do we ascertain to do the least amount of harm? Great, I love the idea of that. Let's do the least amount of harm. What if the least amount of harm causes detriment for someone? And in an example, this is not my own. I utilize it. If you could travel back in time and you had the ability to handle a situation of a very well-known man that unfortunately harmed lots and lots of people, Jewish people and non-Jewish people, and he was in his mommy's tummy, what would you do? That situation. And then people really start to think about moral ethics. And then most people, including atheists, that had this vitriol for God with the Amalekites, all of a sudden said, I I pull the I pull the
Hmm.
plug. Mommy and baby both have to take one for the team kind of situation. And the
Hmm.
reason that is because they are weighing out what they feel is going to be beneficial for the future. And so I say, if you as a human could make that decision, why couldn't a deity make that decision regarding the Amalekites? So that's
Hmm.
the way that I approach divine command theory. So what do you think about all of that?
It's like what I said earlier, where when a lot of what we're doing in science, a lot of what we're doing in theology is we're trying to think God's thoughts after him, trying to figure out what was God thinking when he created this universe? What was God thinking when he commanded these things? What was he thinking when he did this particular miracle, this particular action? Like that's a big thing I try to look at in The Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God, is the role of reasons in God in all of our theology, because I think that what you're pointing out is exactly right. You're trying to get people to empathize a little bit just with each other, and then now
Yeah.
empathize with God. What is it like to be God, and what is it like to make a decision? You have to weigh all these different factors. What are you going to do? Oh, you didn't think about that. Well, maybe get off your high horse for a second and actually think for a second, what this looks like. So I think it's right. I think you're right.
Yeah. Well, I'm not God, so therefore, that's always what I hear. So, taking us to the next question, because I feel like these are going to kind of piggyback off of each other. Because, if God doesn't know something, that gives better reasons for why things happen. Open theism, should we care about it? Why or why not? Because if God foreknows something is going to happen, then, you know, am I really free? How do these things come into play? What do you think?
I think it's a very important view in the history of ideas, and I think it's one of the important models of God worth considering. So I've written a couple papers on this. My wife and I actually wrote a paper together on molecular biology and open theism, trying to defend open theism from a particular view.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
me and my
there's just
wife are just writing molecular.
yeah. Well, she's a
Look at
molecular
me, right?
biologist,
You
so
guys are smart, okay?
so here's what happened is, so when we were dating, she's asking different questions about like what I'm working on, what I'm doing, and then and she doesn't know a lot about theology, and so I was telling her about, here's all these different models of God, and I told her about open theism. She's like, well, that seems right. Why would people reject it? I was like, well, there's some biblical stuff, and she's like, okay, so your book, and I'm like, sure. I guess she's Italian, so there's a joke related to that phrase, the book. And then and she's like, what other reasons? And I was like, well, there's this one issue, is if God creates a universe and he doesn't know what's going to happen, isn't that too risky? Like, he's taking a huge risk.
Right.
And one of the more famous foundational books on open theism in the 20th century, or I'm sorry, the 21st century, is called "The God Who Risks." Like that's the title of the book. So like, talk about all this risk. And she's like, well, God's not an idiot. He's going to put like things in place to like mitigate the risk. And I was like, yeah. And her lab, that's what they were doing, was they were looking at RNA and DNA. And
Uh,
there's these things called risk management systems in our DNA and RNA. And that's what her lab was doing, was just identifying all these different ones. And she's like, if open theism is true, this is the kind of universe you would expect God to create, where there's risks, but there's risk management systems.
yeah.
And so we developed this into an argument to say, this is the kind of universe you'd expect God to create if open theism's true. And all this worry about, oh, God's too risky. It's like, no, he's not. He's put stuff in place to make sure that isn't there. So I think it's a really serious contender in terms
Yeah.
of different views about God.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say I'm quite on board yet. Give me a
Mhm.
reason to be on board. Give me an example of like what would be a good, like a biblical argument. So here's one that in my
Mhm.
mind I would think is like a, so I've always stated, for the most part, God set things in play, kind of like a deistic, and I don't believe, I'm definitely a theist,
Sure.
but that God set things in a cyclical way. And there are very few times where God really kind of dips into what we would perceive as our reality. Because otherwise, having got like, imagine me doing this interview right now and God's in the corner and he's like staring at me and I'm like, okay, man, this is feeling, can you not micromanage me? I feel lit
Yeah.
things. So
Mhm.
the presence of God 24/7 all the time, I think would maybe mess with our decision making a bit. So
Yes.
not that it would take away our free will, right? But it would be like your boss being there 24/7.
Yeah.
So the point that I'm getting at is like Jonah, right? He stepped in a little more. He's like, you're not doing what I want you to do. So here's
Mhm.
what we're gonna do. So is that a good open theistic like play to like Courtney? Let me just pull you on over into open theism because I'm just not convinced quite yet. What do you think?
Yeah, no, everything you laid out actually I do in the little book about a big God as well, where I talk about if God's presence were like really
Yeah.
felt all the time, you would go nuts. Like you would just you wouldn't really be able to function properly,
I wouldn't go to the
and you wouldn't.
restroom. I wouldn't be undressed. I
Yes,
wouldn't
exactly.
eat. Yeah.
Yeah. So like when I was 16, no, I was 15, I went to this Christian like youth conference. And that year, like they kept having this big slogan they would use that I think was like an anti-pornography slogan. I can't quite remember, but it was like, don't do anything that you wouldn't feel comfortable doing if Jesus was in the room with you.
Yeah.
And so I'm 15, so my mind's going all over the place, you know.
Yeah.
But my first thought was, well, I'm not going to watch TV. That's rude, you know. Like,
Right.
you know, you've got a guest, you know. And then, but then I thought, well, I'm going to have to go to the bathroom. I'm not going to do that. What about when I get married, my honeymoon, like, you know, like you know, all these things that are like totally fine to do, but it's just weird if Jesus is standing there.
Exactly.
So yeah, so but open theists though, a lot of them will go, yeah, that's right. So God's not going to be like super hands on all the time. He's actually going to be more hands off. But there are going to be these moments where he will intervene when he thinks it's right to do so, and the Jonah case might be one of them. So that is so everything you've articulated so far. I think a lot of open theists are going to be like, yeah, that's totally fine, Courtney. Like that's great. Like we like that. Where it gets more specifically open theist would be about, does God really know the future? And so the Jonah case is an interesting one because one of the questions is about prophecy, because it seems like if God doesn't know the future, then what's all this prophecy going on about?
Right.
And so here's a very common claim you'll see in a lot of Jewish philosophy, and then a lot of contemporary biblical scholars will say prophecies in the Old Testament are primarily conditional, even if it's not always stated. So I remember my Old Testament professor in undergrad making this really clear when he taught us like the book of Jonah. He's like, Jonah hates these people so much, he's not even willing to give the full prophecy. He's just going around saying like, you're all screwed in 8 days, you know, and then he like sets up a like, you know, like watch everything happen, and then he gets mad at God when, you know, like, God's like, the people repented, I'm not going to
Yeah.
destroy them, and Jonah's like, but I hate these people, I
I
want you to destroy.
knew you would.
And
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah. He's mad at
yeah,
God because he's like, I knew.
exactly. And so that's
Why am I
what's
saying 40 days? You said there. I already knew you were merciful.
Mhm. Yeah, and so what you'll see a lot of open theists do, and then a lot of biblical scholars will also do this thing. They'll say, right, what you have here is we got all these other cases of where the prophecies are conditional, that we should just assume that this is the case when we read the book of Jonah. And that tells us really interesting insights into, because Jonah doesn't want to talk to these people because
Yeah.
yeah, exactly as you pointed out, he's like, well, I
Well,
knew you'd forgive them. Yeah. And so Jonah's like, I'm not even going to give the full prophecy because I hate these people. Screw them. And you're like,
yeah.
that feels very human to me. Like I
It
can,
feels so human. It's so human. Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
think the case of Jonah is a very human story, and what you see there, like you see in other places, is the conditional nature of prophecy. And so open theists, they like to point that out, to say
Hmm.
it's not that God has this exhaustive knowledge of the future. It's not that the prophecies are always these conditionals.
Yeah. So my response to that has typically been, um, then God is just really good at analyzing, and God is really good at kind of knowing his creation. Now, here's the issue: the way God learns is by watching things happen, right? He gave
Mhm.
left versus right. 10 out of 10 times they choose right. Therefore, God's going to make a prophecy based on that, so that it's kind of self fulfilling in that. So here's my issue: prior to creation, there would be no analytics, there would be no data. There's
Yep.
nothing for humans, there's nothing for God to look at and assess and go, okay, well, I think in light of these little creatures that I've created, watching them like rats, they're going to choose this route the majority of the time. We just don't have that. And so my statement with the lamb was slain since the foundation, or from the foundation of the
Mm-hmm.
earth, it seems a little bit like God put that in there, and that seems to be correlated with, at least in the theological, Genesis 3 for Christians. Um, so I'm not quite convinced. I do think that God has fail safes that he puts in where in my example is God will come in there and twist your arm a little bit until you
Mhm.
break, so to speak. But I don't think that that's God dabbling 24/7. That's not him in here right now, going, Courtney, you didn't ask this question, and it's
Yeah.
that presence. But he pops in sometimes like, not doing what I need you to do. Let me press you a little harder. So I don't know quite where I'm landing. I'm just not fully convinced in light of
Mhm.
prophecies, in light of knowing that some are even conditional and some are stated, some aren't. I acknowledge that. But it seems to me, when I assess all the data of the theological, I can't quite get on board fully. And and it's not that I'm like, get me on board. I just really want to make sure before I commit that I've,
Mhm.
assessed all the points that need to be assessed. So, yeah. Am I being reasonable
Yeah.
here?
I mean, you're actually, I'm in the same position
Yeah.
because I look at different biblical statements and I'm like, well, it says God's got foreknowledge. And the open theist is like, right, like God knows a whole lot of stuff about the future. He's got really good predictions. And I'm like, is that is that really enough? I don't know. So so a lot of the exegetical points you're raising are the exact kind of worries I have. Um, when it comes to the foundation of the world, though, so here's one claim that the open theist can make, which eventually convinced me, at least on this particular point.
Okay.
So there's this question: what was God doing before He created the universe? And
Ooh,
and I want to say, yeah, yeah. So Augustine says, yeah, like he's creating hell for people ask those kind of questions, and then he's like, that's a joke. We shouldn't take those jokes too seriously. And I'm like, you took it pretty seriously. Like, so I think Augustine's being very funny, but he's a rhetorician, so of course he's going to be funny. But Paul, what you see in like Peter and Paul is this idea that prior to creation, there's God planning. He's plotting to take over the world, and that's the view that I prefer. What was God doing before He created? He's plotting to take over the world. He's saying, I have certain goals in mind. One of which is to create sentient beings that I can enter into friendship with. And part of that, in order to achieve that goal, I'm going to become incarnate. And so you could have that all up front. Now, it's really easy to see how you do that if you've got something like Molinism, where God's like, here's all these possible worlds, and that's the one I want
yeah.
to do.
I picked this
Whereas
one.
on, yeah, I picked that one. So I know I'm going to get these humans. I know I'm going to get an incarnation. So it's all great. Open
And
theists can say the same thing, though.
you're a Molinist, right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that at the moment, at least, yeah, because like I said, open theism is really attractive. Molinism has got some problems, but I go back and forth. I'm like, is this
Yeah.
really that big of a problem? And then other times I'm like, oh, that actually is a really bad problem.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. I agree. I think I'm like 1 foot, maybe I knew you were going to go pre-creation because again, like if God is eternal, obviously, and we're going to go in like this as
Mhm.
far back, let's fathom as far back because that's eternal for humans, as far back as we can fathom, right? God was there. What was He doing? Was He planning? Okay, He was planning, but still planning unless you just completely remove all free will, like hard determinism, right? Unless you completely remove all free will, how is He able to know what that the little rats are going to choose this same path without hardwiring brains to choose that path? It just not quite there
Yeah,
yet for me. But so
yeah.
that's gonna, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. Like, yeah, I get the point. Like, it's a worry that I have.
Gotcha. So that's going to take us into this next one. The omnis, are they problematic for God of the Bible and free will? Let me read that again. The omnis, are they problematic for the God of the Bible and free will if free will is defined different over time? Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this, like the difference between free will and choice versus free action, right? And the correlations between like, no, free will is the not that you will it, meaning you will to jump up, but gravity's gonna reality check you and bring you back down. So it's against your will, ergo no free will. Some would call that free choice. And then you have, the free action. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I so Lee Weissens, she teaches in I think she's in South Dakota now, and she has this nice little book that she wrote with Simon Kettle called "God and the Problem of Human Freedom," or "The Problem of God and Human Freedom," and what they point out is free will in the sense of like, I've got this power to do stuff, like that's cool, like that's obviously important, but she's like, that's not what we really care about. What we really care about is the choices, because otherwise you get in the gravity case being one. Be like, sure, I'd like to have that, but you don't. So
Unlimited.
no, what you care about is other stuff. And I'm like, that seems right to me. So the free choices is what we really care about. And now it depends. If the omnis, I don't think the omnis by themselves are a problem. What I think is the problem is what kind of universe you think God created. Do you think God created a fully deterministic universe where he has to cause all the things to happen? Or do you think he created a universe where maybe there's a settled timeline, like a Molinist would say, but God's not causing everything that happens? Or you an open theist and you think God created a universe where the future is completely open, and he's just like, let's see what happens. So I think on the determinist sort of universe, I don't see you could possibly get free choice. And I can run some arguments if you want, but I just don't see how you're going to get it. Whereas on Molinism and open theist universes, I can see how you're going to get free will quite easily.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting whenever we're talking about this because it seems as though no one really knows the definition of free will, right? Like you said, no one cares about gravity, but like, what is free will? How are we actually defining like what is that? I don't even know what you mean whenever you say that. Like, does God knowing something ahead of time is going to happen? Does that negate the fact that you actually chose it?
Right. So here's the definition that I think is usually quite a good one. So you are free in the sense that you have the ability to perform an action for a reason, and you're the source of that action, and you also have the ability to do otherwise. Not the ability to do otherwise right now, because you're already sitting. You don't have the choice to like be doing something else right now because it's too late. You already made a choice. At the next moment, could you stand up or sit down? That's where the choices come in at the next moment. And this is a pretty old view. Peter Lombard in the Middle Ages, like that's the way he lays it out. And then he's like, God has this free will too. Oh, but God's timeless. So I got to change the definition. I'm like, well, tell me, Peter, how are you going to change it? He's like, I don't have time for that. I got to talk about something else. I'm like, thanks for nothing. But so these are very like old views on free will. And I think it's something like that. Yeah. And so that's the questions where a lot of times where people are worried about, do I actually have free will, is the issue of, do I have the ability to do otherwise? So when you're looking at these issues about, we'll say God foreknows this is what you're going to do. You're like, well, if he already knows I'm going to do it, then I can't do otherwise.
Yeah.
And so there's this worry that the choice I make, does that really matter? And someone like Augustine's going to go, yeah, it does matter, because God foreknows that what your reasons are going to be for why you're going to do that.
Yeah.
And so we'll try to say like it's still all consistent, but that's where the debates usually go.
Yeah. So wasn't it? I want to say it was Augustine that made this statement. And I'm going to botch this, but just something like free will, as far as when it comes to ethics and morals, is the ability to choose a different moral outcome than, like, again, the whole, not in this moment you're sitting, but in the next moment, like in the very next breath or moment, can you choose to be immoral or moral? Like, do you have those? I can't remember who it was. I'll find it and I'll like message you about it. But
Yeah,
I,
you see that in Augustine's earlier work. So his earlier
okay,
treatise on which is just called On Free Choice or On Free Will. Later on in life, he writes this thing called the Retractions, because he has this debate with this monk named Pelagius, and so it gets really ugly. And Augustine's like, I regret saying all these things, and so he rewrites like tons of stuff. He's just like, I know I said this, but I no longer believe it. And you're like, ooh, and so a lot of the free will kind of, yeah, just kind of goes out the window at that point. Which I'm like, oh man, I really like those parts.
so
Augustine play is like,
did he get cooked in the debate or something?
see, this is what's hard to figure out, because you have to like piece together a lot of the different things in the debate, and like the Catholic Church like officially didn't really side with either position fully. So it's
Yeah.
so sometimes you'll have this story about like, well, they took a semi-Pelagian view. I'm like, what on earth is that? I don't know. And so yeah, it's this just this really messy, complicated issue. And the Catholic Church, they don't really go exactly with Augustine, and they're like, we don't like Pelagius, some of his stuff, but we don't want to go all the way with Augustine. We'll do something vague in the middle. And you're like,
Yeah.
cool.
Gotcha. So that's funny because it's like the vagueness there gives, I guess, leeway for some sort of self-determined view of something, because it's like, well, no, we're not really committed. I believe this, but it's so funny because the church is very unified in that aspect, like what they want you to believe. So it's interesting how there's some leeway, but there's still like a controlled narrative, so to speak. And that's across the board. That's Judaism, Islam, that's anything.
Yeah.
So
but the Catholic Church is very good at this. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be too much of a heretic, but like this, we're going to give you just a little bit of, So interesting. Can you be epistemically certain about God in light of our faculties, right? So this kind of would play into this. So the church doesn't really give us a lot of guidance, just enough rope, as some would say. But what's the best method to use to be certain as possible about what we know, our intuitions, the world around us, God, everything?
Oh gosh. I find epistemology kind of boring. So, because I'm just like, you think really hard, you consider
Yeah.
arguments for and against views. What more do you want? Like, I mean, I don't
Really?
really know what else to say. Yeah, because like there's like different debates about like externalism and internalism, and I used to be really interested in those. And then the way the debates like developed and moved on, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, we're kind of all agreeing on a lot of the same issues here at the end of the day. And they're like, yeah, we just thought there was a bigger divide on some of these things in the past. So I haven't been able to really keep up with that because I've been doing other research projects. But as far as I can tell, yeah, you're sitting down, you're thinking really hard. You look at your intuitions, you look at testimony, you look at a plurality of things. I don't think there is a nice, neat method that is this royal road to truth. I just don't think we have one.
Yeah, I can agree to that. Except for maybe I'm gonna go back to the whole God's in control of everything. So there's my scapegoat
Sure.
for that. So
Yeah.
for me, but that's a faith-based statement. All right, Ryan. So here's going to be the last question. So I heard you mentioned that you were working on another book. I don't know how you guys do it. Okay, I'm just going to be honest. I'm still working on my first book, but I'm also a mom and I'm a wife. I'm a trad wife at that. So I've got things going on. But what are you currently working on that we should be aware of? So your book, I'm definitely going to get that one. Any other projects, any other lectures? Can people, buy in on some lectures, and tell us what you're doing?
It's a couple different things. I guess I'll just focus on two different books. So one is Muhammad Saleh Zapor. He's a Islamic philosopher at the University of Manchester. And we're hoping to do a debate book on what is God like. So he wants to do kind of this Avicena sort of where like God is simple and the universe is like co-eternal and necessary and all this stuff. And I'm gonna be like, no, God's definitely more personal and this kind of thing. So yeah, what are you thinking?
So is he going to take the divine simplicity position?
Yep.
Really? Okay. Okay, that'll be interesting. That's okay. Go ahead. Tell us more.
Yeah. So I'm hoping, like we've talked a lot about it. We've written some drafts of it. We have a publisher that's interested. We just have to figure out if we can actually like the time commitments if he can do it. I'm all in because yeah, like he's a really cool guy. It'll be a very friendly debate. And I think we'll be able to do a good job. You could really see here's all the different issues at play. So that's one of them. There's a popular level book I just got the contract for. It's going to be called Letters from a Reluctant Theologian, because that's the name of my podcast, is the Reluctant Theologian podcast. And it's going to be basically each chapter is going to be written the way I write a podcast episode. So it's like very easy to understand, very sarcastic, very humorous, very vulnerable. And so what I want is people to be able to like laugh and cry and like walk away like knowing something. Yeah. And a lot of the topics that I was asked to address, I can't do because I'm only an expert on so many things. So I got a lot of my friends from around the world to promise to like contribute an essay. So I've got a friend who's going to do like Jewish entry and Islamic entry. I've got one of my atheist friends who's going to explain why she cares about these religious questions, even though she's an atheist. My wife's going to do an essay on why philosophers should care about science. So like it's all over the place. So it's gonna be, and each one's gonna be like 5 pages long. So it's like I'm forcing them to be like, yeah, be vulnerable, be funny, be whatever, but you only got 5 pages. So
yeah. That sounds great. And will it be written in like a easy to digest kind of form? I mean, because 5 pages, theoretically, you can't get too deep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like
so
that.
like, because some of the episodes I've got coming out soon are samples of ones I've already written, actually. So you'll get to hear quite soon like what some of that might look like. And then I've got a couple sample chapters already from a few people, like Linda Zagzebski. She wrote this one. So she has this view where God has like maximal empathy, like he empathizes with everything that you feel. And so she wrote this really nice essay on that and the role it plays in her devotional life and her philosophical interests. So it's like a mixture of like devotion and philosophical interests. I'm like, this is exactly what I want for this. So this is cool.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. Well, so where can people find, like you said, are you gonna put some of this on your podcast? Or are you gonna put like little scripts on your website for download? Where are you gonna? Or you're just gonna compile it all and put it in the book?
So it's going to be a bit of both. So some of the episodes that I'm releasing over the next couple months are some of the just a handful of the chapters that are in there, and then once it's all said and done, it's going to be published with Cascade, which is it's going to be my Doctrine of God series. So it'll be another book that's short, sweet, and only like $20 instead of the $200 and your firstborn child, like the cost of the academic books usually are.
Yes, I'm telling you, it's a lot out there for those of us who just keep buying books. And that's another problem. I'll keep buying a book and then I'll read like relevant portions and then I won't read the whole thing. And then I feel super guilty, like the whole lady crossing the road. Should I have done that? Even though there was someone like so I get it. So yeah. Where can we find your videos? Thank you for doing the interview. I know you do those. I know you're on TikTok. What are your socials? Where can people learn about you, digest some of your information? Like I said, at least for me, I don't feel fully qualified to speak on a lot of what you say. And it took me, like, I guess a year to get to this point to even just tap in a little bit of some of your big brain. But where can people find you so they can learn more?
Mm-hmm. So the easiest place is rtmullins.com. And so I've got a lot of my papers up there, not all of them, but all the ones I'm able to give away for free, I've got up there. Links to books, links to the podcast, links to all the video interviews I've done. I forget what my name on YouTube is. I think it's like the RT Mullins. I think it's the same as like my TikTok.
It's similar.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so I'm on Instagram and Facebook and anytime there's a new social media that opens up, I go ahead and like get my name in there just in case it takes off. And then most of them never take off. So it doesn't matter. And I've forgotten that I'm even on there anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah. So but the main thing is, you go to the website and I think I've got links to everything.
Yeah. So Chatter is another one. It's sort of like Clubhouse. It's a debate format, but it has, it's like TikTok, but it's audio. So you could actually do presentations there. Get in now. Let me know if you want an invite. It's like super like elite right now. You got to have an invite to get in. It's weird, but that's it. Yeah. So that's another one. They are working out some kinks, but yep, that's it. Okay. I appreciate your time. I hope that everyone realizes that this was just like skipping a rock across water. This was so shallow, guys, comparative to what he knows and the data that he has put out for you to digest. So please do not see this as an end all be all. Go on over to his stuff, look at his articles. He's written so many, he's written books. Please go and read it because like I said, he won't say it, I will. He's a big brain. So that's my closing for the day. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your time. Tell your wife I said thank you for allowing the hour and 5 minutes for you to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Until next time, shalom.